Welcome everyone to the fourth hearing of the International Parliamentary Inquiry into the global response to the crisis in Myanmar. I am Heidi Hautala, and I am the chair of the inquiry, as well as Vice President of the European Parliament. And I'm speaking to you today from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Also with us today are my colleague members of the inquiry, Honourable Mercy Barends, Indonesian MP, who's also a member of the board of the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights. And we have Honourable Taufik Basari, Indonesian Member of Parliament. We have Honourable Amadou Camara, a Gambian MP, who's also on the steering committee of the African Parliamentarians for Human Rights. And we have, he's also a South African Member of Parliament. No, let me see. No, sorry, we don't have Mr. Piwmow today. So, and we do have Honourable Nitipon Piwmow, Member of Parliament from Thailand. So I would like to start by reminding you about the intention in establishing this inquiry. It is to provide a distinctly different and parliamentary response to the appalling atrocities perpetrated by the Myanmar military since the coup in February last year. The global responses have fallen far short of the expectations of the Myanmar people and of international obligations and standards. There is a legitimate concern that the international community's failure to impact change in Myanmar not only legitimizes the junta by default and worsens a major humanitarian crisis, but its inaction also risks emboldening other brutal regimes by showing that atrocities can occur with impunity. This parliamentary inquiry will provide policy recommendations for effective action that international actors can take in an effort to save the lives, health and livelihoods of millions of Myanmar people and prevent the further occurrence of international crimes. While we are inviting witnesses to our hearings, calling for written submissions and requests for information, we would like to make it clear that the final report will be the result of the collective editorial decisions of the committee members. The International Parliamentary Inquiry strives to abide by the highest standards of collegiality and mutual respect across genders, ages and cultures in its work. Now, today, I'm happy to communicate that we have 4 witnesses for the hearing. Firstly, we have Matthew Wells, Amnesty International's Crisis Response Deputy Director for Thematic Issues. We also have Dr. Ashley South, he's a research fellow at Chiang Mai University in Thailand. We have Salai Za Uk Ling, Deputy Executive Director of the Chin Human Rights Organization. And we have, fourthly, Adelina Kamau, who is former Executive Director of ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, the so-called HAA Center. And currently, she is Associate Senior Fellow at the Yusof Ishak Institute, ISEAS. If there are members of the media who wish to receive comment from or interview members of the IPI, they are welcome to contact the IPI Secretariat by email at ipi@aseanmp.org. So without further ado, let us now hear from our first witness, Matthew Wells. Thank you very much for your participation in this hearing. So I would like to give you now the floor, Mr. Wells.
Thank you. Thank you, distinguished committee of parliamentarians, for the privilege of speaking today at this important hearing. A colleague and I have just returned from 2 weeks in Kaya State, also referred to as Karenni State, in Myanmar. We were in Damoso and Pruso townships, where there's been heavy fighting between the military and armed groups throughout this year, and where civilians from ethnic minorities and civilians who have risen up in protest against the coup have been targeted with collective punishments by the military. I'd like to quickly relay 2 things that stood out from that trip before turning to the global response and what's needed. First, less than 2 weeks ago, my colleague and I stood on a dirt path outside Moso village. We looked at the charred remnants of some 11 vehicles and motorbikes, where on the 24th of December last year, Myanmar soldiers murdered at least 35 civilians. The soldiers then burned the bodies so beyond recognition that the medical professionals who performed the autopsies at times could not even determine the victim's sex. The evidence that has come to light, despite the military's best efforts at a cover-up, demonstrate clearly that these were extrajudicial executions. Second, we went to a church in Danyaku village, around which the military had laid at least 8 landmines. Think about that. On a path to enter a church, the military had laid landmines. In mid-June, they also burned down the church and the priest's house next door, where many people in the village were storing their grain. My colleague and I interviewed a 17-year-old girl who stepped on a landmine when trying to go to the bathroom next to a rocky path. We documented another case where a man in his 60s died after stepping on a landmine in his village as he tried to collect jaw fruit near his home. The military is laying landmines on a massive scale across these conflict-affected areas of Kaya State, very often inside villages, even inside homes. Landmines like these are inherently indiscriminate. Most of the world has long stopped using these weapons. But today, the military's widespread use, its truly callous use, is killing and seriously injuring civilians and stopping many from returning home or from planting their rice fields this year. I start with these 2 observations because to assess the global response and what's needed, we have to look squarely in the face of what the military is unleashing on civilians across the country. My focus has been on the conflicts in eastern Myanmar, where Amnesty has documented military war crimes and likely crimes against humanity. That includes through a relentless barrage on villages with mortar fire and at times airstrikes. Other colleagues of mine are documenting the military's widespread use of torture in detention sites against protesters and against others who have bravely raised their voices. That brings me to what's needed globally when faced with that reality. That systematic onslaught that is escalating month on month. First, and what should be easy, the world has to actually pay attention to what's happening in Myanmar. It's largely turned away to its shame. The UN Security Council has not held a single open hearing on Myanmar in the 18 months since the coup, not one. It's rarely held closed door meetings. This has to change. So long as the world refuses to pay attention to what's happening, hides from the atrocities occurring every day, the situation will continue to deteriorate. ASEAN collectively and as individual states should push for global attention, including by issuing public demands for regular open Security Council meetings. The world cannot improve a situation from which it is actively looking away. Second, there's an urgent need for a comprehensive arms embargo to stop the flow of weapons. Every weapon sold or transferred to the Myanmar military is likely to be used against civilians. Across the country, evidence of that is overwhelming. Targeting civilians, punishing civilians is central to the military strategy. Countries around the world, including those in ASEAN, need to signal clear support for an arms embargo by the UN Security Council. And if the Security Council will not act, each state around the world must ensure that neither its government nor companies operating there are supplying weapons to a military that is actively targeting civilians. This arms embargo must include the military's aviation fuel, which supplies the military's fighter jets that are pounding towns and villages and killing civilians, such as the 16 and 12-year-old sisters who were killed in the middle of the night in Rekibu IDP camp when the military bombs that camp in Kaya State in January this year. Third, there must be further support for justice and accountability. This should ideally come through a referral to the International Criminal Court. But again, if the Security Council refuses to act, countries need to get creative. Expand support for the IIMM and make sure it has access to all countries where it can do investigations. Pursue cases through universal jurisdiction. Provide further funding for the incredible local human rights documentation happening across the country by groups like the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners, the Karenni Human Rights Group, the Karen Human Rights Group, the Chen Human Rights Foundation, and the Kachin Women's Association Thailand, among many others. Evidence needs to be collected and preserved to pave the way for prosecutions tomorrow. The military has had 60 years of impunity. Accountability is essential to resolving this crisis. Fourth, the world has to increase its humanitarian assistance. listening to local civil society groups about emergency needs that exist and about how aid can best be delivered amid a challenging environment. And let's be clear, the environment is challenging because of the military. I've spoken with medical professionals who had medicines and equipment they were trying to transport to conflict-affected areas stopped and seized at military checkpoints. I've spoken with aid workers who had blankets and mosquito nets stopped by the military. If the world thinks that the SAC is going to allow the free flow of aid to communities that are affected by the conflict and who desperately need that assistance, I apologize for the bluntness here, but it is painfully naive. And the needs are growing. Across Eastern Myanmar, many people have not been able to plant rice this year because of the fighting, the military's abuses, and landmines. Almost a quarter of Myanmar's population is already experiencing food insecurity. In some IDP camps in Kaya State that we visited, rice is running low. Without the harvest for many people this year, it will get much worse in the months ahead. So aid must be increased now, and donors, UN agencies, and others must work with local partners to provide assistance that is not controlled by the military. They should streamline processes for that assistance so that local partners can be responsive to changing dynamics. And for areas where there's no choice but to engage the SAC because it controls the relevant roads, the international community must significantly increase pressure on it to stop blocking delivery of aid. Fifth, and finally, I want to try to end on the smallest note of hope. At hospitals deep in the jungle of Kaya State, I spoke with doctors and medical students from Yangon and Mandalay. From their urban practice before the coup, they're now treating civilians injured by mortars and landmines in remote areas with the most rudimentary of equipment. In Cayenne State, also known as Karen, CDM activists were given shelter and protected when put on a rest list by the military. I've met former university students and young professionals who are now collecting small donations from their friends online to buy rice and cooking oil for people who've been forced to flee their homes with little more than the clothes on their backs. The determination, the resourcefulness, and the humanity in face of the military's onslaught is awe-inspiring, truly awe-inspiring. They're working across ethnic groups to support each other and to build a more inclusive Myanmar that revels in its diversity and respects the rights of all. I imagine there'll be other speakers, whether at this hearing or others, who are better placed to go into those dynamics in detail. They'll know more and be more eloquent than I. But in everything this committee does, and in everything the international community does more generally, it should be asking itself whether its efforts are supporting that doctor, that CDM activist, that aid worker, and the civilians they are assisting, or whether it's supporting a military that is treating those civilians as targets and holding itself above the law, as it has for decades. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Matthew, from describing the experiences and observations from your very recent trip to the eastern parts of Myanmar. And your 5 points have been well taken, and we are now in a position to ask you some questions. So I'll ask one myself. Your point on justice and accountability, I think it is really crucial. And you mentioned the different methods and means that can be used if the UN Security Council refuses to act, so that states need to get creative, use the universal jurisdictions and so on. So perhaps you could explain what are the ongoing efforts towards accountability and how you see this being realized. You mentioned very many important things about evidence collections and preservation. So my question is about, concretely speaking, what can we see in terms of accountability? You could perhaps answer now, and then I turn to my colleagues.
Thank you for that question. In terms of ongoing efforts to pursue justice and accountability, at this point, I think there are two main ones. There is the ongoing investigation at the ICC that specifically relates to crimes against the Rohingya that have a nexus with Bangladesh, and that is incredibly important in terms of pursuing accountability for the horrific crimes that took place back in 2017, 2018. But the reality is the ICC should have an expanded jurisdiction here in terms of what it can focus on. It needs to be focusing on crimes under international law that have been committed across Myanmar against all of the ethnic groups across Myanmar. And the best way to do that is through a UN Security Council referral that would expand the scope to ensure that all crimes can be investigated in addition to the atrocities against the Rohingya. There's also then the IIMM that has been set up to collect and preserve evidence and to build case files against individuals. And that's an incredibly important initiative. And that one, by contrast, does have the scope to look across the country and including at the time period and the aftermath of the coup. And so the IIMM needs the full support of the international community in that terms, and that means in terms of resources to make sure that it can do its investigation. And that means access to countries where it needs to be able to get to in order to build out full investigations. So that would include, for example, a country like Thailand, where there is important evidence that relates to crimes being committed right now in eastern Myanmar. And so we need to make sure that countries throughout the region and the international community more generally is putting its full weight behind the IIMM so that, again, it has the resources and the access to do its investigations and to build those cases against the military for crimes committed across the country. And then there are other means, including targeted sanctions against Myanmar officials responsible for human rights violations. There has been, of course, some of that, but it would be far more effective if it came through the Security Council again, or came through a much larger group of countries around the world. And so we need to see, again, an expansion of those sanctions against officials responsible for crimes to make sure that a clear signal is sent about the fact that those crimes will not be tolerated. And then again, the last point which you raised as well is around universal jurisdiction. And so whenever there is a possibility, whenever officials are going to countries and they are responsible for potential crimes under international law, and we know those are happening across the country, we need to make sure that states around the world are ready to pursue justice themselves when a body like the UN Security Council has so far refused to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As a follow-up question, you mentioned several issues related to sanctions. So could you perhaps say a word about the ongoing sanctions, and if you see that there is a international coordination of those sanctions, or perhaps more should be done? So what do you think of the targeted sanctions as a means to stop the atrocities?
Thank you. I mean, I think the sanctions need to be effective. The sanctions need to come through wider multilateral fora like the UN Security Council. At the moment, you have important sanctions against officials being imposed by the EU, by the US, by Canada, by the UK. But the rest of the world has not imposed similar sanctions. And so to truly be effective, they need to come through the UN Security Council, or need to include a much larger group of states and multilateral actors around the world to be more effective. And likewise, with something like an arms embargo, which is another critical issue here to stop the flow of weapons, there are many individual countries that have stopped the sale of weapons or transfer of weapons to the Myanmar military, but to be effective, that needs to go much wider. Again, ideally through the UN Security Council, but if the Security Council is unwilling to act, we need to see much more pressure being put on countries that continue to sell or transfer weapons to the Myanmar military. And there are some countries that I think we all know in this meeting, otherwise will be difficult on that front. But there are still countries that are involved in things like the sale of aviation fuel to the Myanmar military that I think can and should have pressure applied to them to stop that, and that there is the potential, in fact, to reduce the flow further of weapons being supplied to the Myanmar military. So there's a lot more that needs to be done, countries in ASEAN and more generally, again, to cut off this flow. And there are still countries that I think we reasonably can expect, with more pressure, more attention, that we can reduce the flow of these weapons to the military.
Thank you very much. And now I turn to my distinguished MP colleagues who wants to take the floor. I see at least Nitipon Piwmow wants to take the floor. Please, your turn.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, Matthew, for your very the real and important information from Myanmar. My name is Nitipon Piwmow, and I feel so sad that Myanmar people don't have like enough rice or food to eat during this time, and I feel very so bad. Last year, I saw the news that for the Thai soldier that sending food and rice to the Myanmar soldier last year. So regarding for your last traveling to Myanmar, because after I military coup, I don't have any chance to go to Myanmar yet. So I just would like to know that, do you have, any key messages from Myanmar people that you have been, spoken to? I would like to know that what they are asking for the international community for, to help them, or any suggestion for them. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Just as you say, the humanitarian situation is dire, and it's getting worse. And there's not enough assistance that is getting through, and particularly in areas that are outside of the military's control, areas that are controlled by ethnic armed organizations. There's a deliberate effort by the military to block assistance or to severely restrict assistance to get through to those areas. In speaking with the incredible local activists who are on the ground and who are trying to find ways around this, trying to get assistance to the communities that need it, one of the key things is an international community doing more to provide cash transfers assistance to those groups so that they can then source things locally and be able to buy them locally in areas outside of the military's control, and then get them to the communities that need them. Because very often, it's difficult to move things through military controlled areas because of its restrictions, because at times it's actually seizing assistance. And so it would be, I think, often much more effective, or it was told to us that it could be much more effective to provide cash transfers to these local groups on the ground who live amidst the communities, who know the reality, who are best placed in many ways to respond, and who, again, can source a lot of things locally if the cash were to come through. And so I think there's a need to transition more assistance that way, and also to reduce some of the bureaucracy that exists amongst donors from the outside to groups like this. They were describing at times that, funding can take up to 6 months to come through, and what you have pitched 6 months ago versus what happens now 6 months later, the situation on the ground can be extremely different. If you pitch to provide to 1,000 people in a specific IDP camp and the money doesn't come through to 6 months later, there may only be 100 people in that IDP camp now, or there may be 5,000 people in that IDP camp now. And so there's a need to be much more responsive, much quicker in the way that assistance gets through to these groups, so that they can respond to the ever-changing dynamics on the ground. You are having new displacements all the time as a result of the military's attacks. And so we need to be much quicker and more agile. And a lot of that, again, I think could help if it was coming through cash transfers to local groups as opposed to other forms of assistance. And I think, just to conclude by saying that, people that we were speaking with, as I briefly mentioned in opening remarks, people were talking about the rice supply in some areas, running out in the next 2 to 3 months, because you have people who used all of their harvest from last year. They haven't been able to plant this year because they were displaced from their villages, and there's now been landmines laid around their villages, or the military is still present there. And so you have a huge swath of area, particularly in Kaya state, where people have not farmed this year. And that means the situation is going to get much worse. And so we need to be preparing for that now before it gets significantly worse. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Who would wish to take the floor next? I see Mercy, at least. Mercy, please take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Heidi. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much. And I would like to give a high appreciation for Amnesty International that has released the report. It's very useful for us. But as we know that the international response is very slow related with the atrocity in Myanmar people. And when we talk about the security issue, is especially dealing with the veto holders like Russia and China. I don't know whether it's because of there is no directly impact like Russia and Russia and Ukraine war. But what about your opinion when you say before about Security Council must deliver more pressure for the military junta in atrocity situations? Could you please to give a detailed opinion about this so it can be operate effectively? Thank you.
Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, I think the first thing from our perspective, it goes back to the need for open hearings at the UN Security Council. The reality is, countries like China and Russia have been able to get off the hook by the fact that the attention isn't even there in the first place. If you have open hearings and you invite, many of the incredibly strong local civil society speakers that could speak at an event like that and could speak to the realities on the ground and the atrocities being carried out by the military, it would be much harder for countries like China and Russia and others to continue to obstruct. They haven't even had that pressure applied to them up to now, because again, there have been no open hearings. So the first thing I think is far more emphasis on making sure that attention comes from the UN Security Council. We need to hear ASEAN countries speaking out in favor of these sorts of open hearings. We need to see countries, like the US and others on the Security Council apply more pressure, put more of their diplomatic weight behind having things like open hearings at the Security Council. And at least then with that attention, we can make the costs of obstructionism by countries higher. Right now, they're incredibly low. And I think also we should there's a need to distinguish between, Russia and China here. And I think, China has historically at times, played a more nuanced role with Myanmar. But again, I think the fact that there's not even open hearings taking place, there's not any sort of real pressure on countries that are obstructing, it makes it so much easier. And we might get a better sense of China's actual position here and what it's willing to do for the Myanmar military and what it's not willing to do if the costs and the attention were significantly higher. And so to me, that's the first thing that has to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Now I would still invite our colleague Taufik Basari to take the floor. Taufik, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Heidi. Thank you also for Matthew for your information. Based on your information, you emphasize on the international mechanism to raise the issue on Myanmar. And I would like to ask you about what is your suggestion to the parliament members from the countries of ASEAN, like me and other colleagues here, and what kind of action that effectively can support the international mechanism, and what kind of cooperation that we can build as a parliament member that we can build together with the international NGOs to support this advocacy. Thank you.
Thanks. And Matthew, please.
Thank you very much. I think first, I think there needs to be much more, again, kind of global public support from ASEAN countries around the need for these international mechanisms to act in the first place. I think at times the understandable desire to, in many extents, to have consensus amongst all ASEAN countries has meant that then it's been to the lowest common denominator in terms of what is actually happening. And there are many countries, including governments of those on the committee who are here right now, who have, I think, been have played a more positive role, have offered more robust statements in terms of concerns about the military's atrocities. But I think that needs to go further. And if ASEAN as a collective is unable to break the impasse, then we need to hear from individual countries in a much clearer way that they support more robust action from bodies like the UN Security Council or from other countries around the world. And I think having those individual countries, if it can't be ASEAN as a whole, make those sorts of statements publicly, indicate that that desire exists publicly, that then gives much more permission and power to countries around the world to act more robustly. And so I think, I'd encourage as many as possible individual governments to speak out, to be clear about, from their perspective, there is a need for an arms embargo. From their perspective, there is a need for open Security Council meetings. From their perspective, justice for the military's atrocities has to happen to get out of this crisis. And I think then that will hopefully allow and will allow other countries around the world to be more robust in their actions and to respond in the way that's needed. And then, in addition, what I'd say is just, making sure that also within ASEAN itself, that there are not weapons transfers that are taking place to the Myanmar military, that each government needs to be looking very closely at home in both how it as a government is acting, but also how businesses that operate in that country are acting, and whether they are providing weapons or other material that is then being used by the military in human rights violations. And I go back again to the core issue of aviation fuel and how that is then supplying fighter jets that are devastating civilians across Myanmar. And so a need to make sure countries across ASEAN are not supplying aviation fuel, or not involved in the processing of aviation fuel that ends up in the military's hands. And I think those two things, speaking out more publicly in support of robust actions, and then themselves, looking inside to make sure that they're not supporting the military, will go a long way in terms of starting to improve the situation on the ground. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you so much for this brief exchange. And if there is a chance for you perhaps to send written submissions to enlighten our committee, so please do so, and you're of course welcome to stay. So with this, we move